So you want to become a pro wrestling coach. You've been training and wrestling for a while. You're confident enough to teach a beginner's class and you've earned a little bit of respect in the locker room, but exactly what goes in to becoming a great teacher and coach, that's what this episode's all about. Welcome back to World-Beater Wrestling. Today I am very much putting on my school teacher cap, which is something that Damian Slater does in his day-to-day life and has done for quite a while now. So I hope that these tips can give you a different perspective on what makes a good coach or teacher. Firstly, I want to say if your goal is to become a coach, awesome. We need more people like you. I think that it is an honorable thing to want to give back to the community and spread on the lessons that were given to you. And that's the main reason why I became a pro wrestling coach in the first place. Becoming a pro wrestling coach, I did before I became a teacher. And that's what led me to education and my love of that in my day-to-day life. So let me say that if you are an aspiring coach, the one thing you should have, and this is a non-negotiable, is good knowledge of the fundamentals. You need to have that background and that basis, which means you need to have been wrestling and training for long enough. I can't put a number on it because it's too subjective. It changes, and the quality of the training you've had, the quality of the wrestling you've had, the people you've wrestled, the way your mind works, the way your mind processes and picks up information, everyone's different. So I'm not going to put a number on it, but you do have to have a very good grasp of the fundamentals. And I guess that most pro wrestling schools will probably look for this first when they're choosing a new member of staff. At least if they're a reputable school, they're always going to look for someone who has, done a little bit in their career and who always showed a really good grasp of those basics. Now, for me, although this probably isn't necessarily a non-negotiable, I would say that this is definitely something you should look at doing first. Make sure you've trained in different places. If you've only trained under one coach, you don't have a big enough picture of what pro wrestling is and could be. Make sure you've traveled. You've gone around, you've gotten different inputs from different people, you've learnt different styles. Because what happens if you have to eventually teach a different style of wrestling and you don't really know how to do it? You haven't been exposed to that. I'm not saying you have to go to Mexico and learn lucha and go to Japan and learn strong style and all the rest. If you could, that'd be awesome. But at least have gone to a few different places and picked up different perspectives. I think to be an effective coach, you also have to have a really good understanding of the why of pro wrestling. It's something I always mention, the why. You need to know the principles behind the actions. It's one thing to teach the steps of a movement, but if you can't provide the right context, if you can't teach your trainees when, where, how, and exactly why they should apply this technique, it's not meaningful to them. At best, they won't really know where to do it once they start wrestling, and at worst, it'll just switch them off completely because it's no longer relevant. Okay, so you've got all of these things under your belt, you've traveled, you've trained elsewhere, you've got great fundamentals, you've got a good perspective of the why, but this does not necessarily mean you'll be a good coach or teacher. Being a good teacher, personally, I think relationships are number one. Whilst knowledge is a non-negotiable, relationships allow you to deliver those messages successfully. If you can't teach them, it doesn't matter what you've done in your career. It doesn't matter what you know about pro wrestling. You have to make connections. And part of that as a teacher is understanding what makes everyone tick. Understand what motivates them, what they value, understand how they best learn, because there's a lot of different ways that people learn and take in new information. So being good at building those relationships, I think, is very important. If you feel like that's where you're going to struggle, start with that first. Start to build those relationships with those students at your academy, and then maybe think about putting on the coach's hat. I think it's also important to set high expectations for your students, and that all starts with you and the way you model things. You have to be a role model because they're going to pick up on your cues, they're going to take after you, and if you're unmotivated, that's going to be a disaster for an unmotivated student or for a student who doesn't have the same discipline that you may have had when you were a trainee. So care about what you do. Have a hands-on approach. Be transparent. Be accountable. The more that you can drag motivation out of your students, the better atmosphere you're going to have, the better reputation you're going to get as a trainer. And I'll finish this session with a few little micro tips on how I like to train, some important principles and things I like to think about. Again, it's just one person's opinion, but they've definitely worked for me in the past. First one is make sure that you plan your sessions. Plan A, plan B, plan C. Have a backup for a backup, because you never know what could go wrong in a session. You never know if those 20 trainees who were going to come now goes down to 4 trainees, and all of those skills and drills you were going to run just won't work anymore. So have something in mind. I write them down. That's the teacher nerd in me, but I like to put a bit of thought and effort behind what I put out there. At the same time, you also have to be flexible, and I think that's where having multiple plans does help. But if you see certain weaknesses arise, if you see certain mini lessons pop up, don't be afraid to go towards them. You know, you can go on those tangents. It's going to be more specific to the trainees you've got at the time, so it's going to be super valuable, super relevant. I also like to base my conditioning on the lesson that is being taught if I can. I think pro wrestling for the longest time, you do your 100 squats, you do your 100 push-ups, then you get in the ring. And I just think that's an old school approach. I don't think it helps anything. It might build a little bit of muscular endurance, a little bit of mental toughness, but beyond that, I feel like it's ineffective. So I like to plan warm-ups and conditioning that are going to help with whatever we are doing in ring. If we're doing, more suplex-based things, then I'll throw in a few different bridges and hip hinging movements that can get us ready for the movements we're going to do in the ring. If we're looking at building our endurance for something that is up ahead where we're going to need endurance, then yeah, I'll do a bit more circuit training and I'll change the times and tempos to suit this. But put thought into your conditioning. Don't just throw it away like it's a 20 minutes that starts the lesson but is unimportant to the overall game, because it absolutely can be if you give it the due diligence. I think reps are very important, getting multiple reps of new technique, but I also think scaffolding is equally as important. So making sure that you don't just go from simple skills to way more advanced skills, make sure that you progress on from what you've taught. I like to teach things in blocks, in units, again, as a teacher would. So I'll run a unit for anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks on the same kind of theme. And yeah, I'll insert other little lessons and I'll recap other little lessons from the past. But we have a set theme so we can keep brushing up on that theme. We can start at a very fundamental level, teach the techniques involved, and then we can start to teach them within different contexts. So how you would apply them to a certain match, how you would apply them if this obstacle came up. And then suddenly we go from very basic, fundamental, rudimentary kind of stuff. By the end of the unit, we're applying that, so it's all automated, it's all authentic. They're using it exactly as they would if they were in front of a live audience. On that note, I try to set a bit of a lesson intention first, so a theme of what I want to teach or what I want them to get out of it more appropriately. So by the end of today's lesson or by the end of the month, I want you all to be competent in these 3 or 4 things. And then I kind of let that guide the lesson. So when it comes to these conditioning drills and skills and things in the ring, it's all based back to those final outcomes. Is this getting them closer to the outcomes? If not, probably not worth doing, or at least minimizing the amount of time that you play and work with that. And lastly, I think it's important as you progress to more intermediate and advanced training to give a little bit more student voice. Okay, so give them a little bit more freedom and flexibility to show and demonstrate and apply what they know. You can still use this for beginners to some extent, although their learning is going to be a little bit more based on repetition and based on scaffolding. With the advanced crew, very loose parameters, all contained around the topic that's being taught, but now they have to apply their own sense of self. They have to show their own character. They have to show their own move set within these parameters. I think on top of that, asking questions is very important. You want to get your students thinking. So ask questions not just to check their understanding, but ask questions to push their learning further. If they give you an answer, try to get them to progress on that answer. Get them to think deeply. I feel like this is the best way to get a really good grasp and understanding of pro wrestling, the principles behind it, and how it's going to work for you as an individual. So that's pretty much it. I hope if you are aspiring to be a coach that you do stick with it. It can be a tough job, but it is a very rewarding job. And as I said, a great way to give back to the pro wrestling community. Of course, if you have any suggestions of your own or anything that is plaguing your mind, any questions you may have, please drop them in the comments box below. As always, hit the subscribe button, ring that notification bell, and I will see you next week for another episode of World-Beater Wrestling.
If you want to see more videos like this, click on the subscribe button, spread the word, and if you have any questions or requests for World-Beater Wrestling, don't be afraid to comment below.